The first sensation was pain, sharp, biting cold that seemed to pierce through bone and marrow. "Colonel Madison, Mad Dog," Reynolds gasped as consciousness slammed into her like a freight train, her lungs burning as they remembered how to process oxygen. Her eyes fluttered open, immediately assaulted by the harsh glare of emergency lighting strips that lined the cryopod's interior. Vital signs stabilizing, cognitive functions returning to normal parameters, announced a calm, feminine voice. "Araya, the base's AI system. Good morning, Colonel Reynolds. The date is August 15, 2487. You have been in cryogenic suspension for 247 years, 138 days, 14 hours. Reynolds tried to speak, but her throat felt like sandpaper. A mechanical arm extended from the pod's wall, offering a small cup of clear liquid. She took it with trembling fingers, the warming solution helping to chase away the lingering frost in her veins. "Deep freeze protocol," she managed to rasp out, her mind automatically reciting the emergency codes drilled into her head centuries ago. "Authorization: Reynolds, Madison J. Colonel. Serial number 238 to 447 Alpha Tango." "Authorization confirmed," Araya responded, initiating full Strategic Reserve Force revival sequence. "All 5,000 personnel pods are beginning emergency thaw procedures." The pod's cover slid open with a hydraulic hiss, releasing a cloud of cryo-vapor into the cavernous underground chamber. Reynolds pulled herself up, her muscles protesting after centuries of disuse. The med cocktail in her bloodstream was already working its magic, fighting off the worst effects of long-term suspension. That's when she saw him, a tall, humanoid figure standing near the control console. His skin was a deep purple, almost iridescent under the emergency lights. Two pairs of solid black eyes studied her with what seemed like academic interest. "Fascinating," the creature said in perfect English. "Your recovery time is remarkable for such primitive preservation technology." Reynolds' hand instinctively reached for a sidearm that wasn't there. "Identify yourself," she barked, her voice growing stronger. "This is a restricted United Earth Defense Facility. I am Observer First Class Troll," the alien replied, making a gesture that might have been meant as calming. "Diplomatic Corps of the Coraxian Protectorate. I am here to ease your transition." Around her, other pods were beginning to open. Her soldiers would be waking up soon, into a world that had apparently changed more than any of them could have imagined. Reynolds forced herself to stay focused, to push down the growing dread in her gut. "Protectorate?" she asked, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "Yes." Skrull's expression was unreadable. "Earth and its colonies have been under Coraxian protection for the past 213 years. Your species is safe now. The war is long over." Reynolds steadied herself against her pod, decades of military training helping her maintain composure. "We lost." "That depends entirely on your perspective," Skrull said, his tone almost gentle. "Your species survived. You adapted. You thrived under our guidance. Many would call that a victory of sorts." Before Reynolds could respond, a series of alarms began blaring throughout the facility. On the massive status wall, thousands of vital sign readouts were coming online as her soldiers began to wake. She could hear the first confused voices, the sounds of people retching up cryo fluid, the disoriented questions. "Araya," Reynolds called out, straightening her back. "Status report on revival operation. 4,892 pods reporting successful revival initiation. 108 pods showing potential complications. Medical response teams are being automated. Awaiting your orders, Colonel." Reynolds looked at Skrull, then at her awakening army. They were trained for this, trained to be humanity's last card in an unwinnable war. But they'd slept through that war, through their species' defeat, through generations of protection. Now they were awake, in a world that had moved on without them. "Begin emergency revival protocols," she ordered, her voice carrying across the chamber. "I want every able body combat ready in 30 minutes. She fixed her gaze on the Coraxian observer. We have a lot to catch up on. The Coraxian Welcome Center was a marvel of crystalline architecture and flowing energy fields, but Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling she was standing in a museum exhibit. Her soldiers, still dressed in their 23rd century combat fatigues, drew stares from the steady stream of aliens and modernized humans who passed through the facility's transparent walls. And this, announced guide specialist Anxpera to her tour group, is a pristine example of pre-integration human military structure. Note their rigid posture and primitive projectile weapons. She gestured toward Reynolds' squad with 3 of her 4 arms. Simply fascinating. Reynolds gritted her teeth, maintaining her parade rest stance. After 2 weeks of cultural acclimation, she was getting tired of being treated like a perfectly preserved fossil. Beside her, Sergeant Miller shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively checking the empty holster where his sidearm should have been. "Ma'am," Miller whispered, "did you see what I saw during the tech demonstration this morning?" "You mean how their targeting systems completely missed your hand signals?" Reynolds kept her voice low, her eyes forward. "Or how their quantum scanners didn't pick up our old radio frequencies?" "Both. Their tech is so advanced it's wrapped right around to stupid. They've forgotten what to look for." A new group approached, high-ranking Coraxian military officials, their ceremonial armor gleaming with embedded AI processors. At their head was General Thor, his purple skin decorated with bioluminescent patterns denoting his prestigious status. "Colonel Reynolds," he announced, his translator making his tone sound almost condescending. "We've reviewed your force's capabilities. Most quaint. I believe we found the perfect solution for your people's future role." Reynolds straightened. "Sir, a living military museum. Think of it. You'll preserve these ancient techniques for future study. Daily demonstrations of obsolete combat forms, historical reenactments, the educational value alone. Request permission to offer an alternative." "Sir," Reynolds interrupted, an idea crystallizing. The general's secondary eyes blinked in surprise. "Proceed. A full combat demonstration. My entire force against your modern peacekeepers. Live fire exercise." The surrounding Coraxians erupted in chittering sounds that her translator identified as laughter. General Thor's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with amusement. "Colonel, our standard peacekeeping drone could neutralize your entire company before your primitive weapons could acquire a target lock." "Then you have nothing to lose," Reynolds pressed. "Think of the spectacle. The public relations value. Ancient warriors against modern might." The general's patterns shifted to a contemplative purple. "You would risk humiliation of your forces. We've been asleep for 2 centuries, sir. Humiliation is better than irrelevance." After a long moment, Thor nodded. "Granted. We'll schedule the demonstration for next month's Victory Day celebration. It will serve as an excellent reminder of how far we've brought your species." As the Coraxians moved away, Miller leaned closer. "Ma'am, are you sure about this? Their tech is centuries ahead of ours." Reynolds watched the aliens go, noting how their perfect formation was controlled by linked AI systems, how their weapons moved in precise, predictable patterns. "Sergeant, do you remember that time in Brazil when we had to take out an entire cartel using nothing but paper clips and chewing gum? Because our tech was scrambled by their EMP. How could I forget? Most terrifying 3 hours of my—" Miller's eyes widened as he caught on. Oh, damn, Colonel." Reynolds allowed herself a small smile. "Get the word out to our people. Training starts tonight." And Miller, "Mom, find me every obsolete piece of equipment they haven't locked away yet, especially the analog stuff. It's time to remind these aliens why humanity survived long enough to reach the stars in the first place." As they spoke, a sleek combat drone floated past, its sensors sweeping the room in predictable patterns, completely missing the old-fashioned hand signals passing between the supposedly primitive human soldiers. Reynolds watched it go, already counting weaknesses, already planning. The Coraxians had forgotten something crucial about humans. Sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the most advanced. It's the one your enemy doesn't think to fear. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath New Shanghai stank of rust and decades of neglect. Reynolds moved through the darkness, her night vision gear, scrounged from a military history museum, painting the world in shades of green. Behind her, 200 of her best operators moved in perfect silence, their boots barely whispering against the ancient concrete. "Clear," whispered Lieutenant Chung from up ahead. Sensor sweep shows we're below their regular patrol routes. Even their deep-ground drones don't come down this far. Perfect. Reynolds activated her ancient radio, a technology so old it was invisible to modern scanning systems. "All units, Operation Throwback is live. Let's show these kids how we used to do it." The tunnel erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers unpacked equipment that would have been cutting edge in their time, but now qualified as antiques. Physical maps were unrolled, their paper surfaces immune to electronic warfare. Mechanical compasses, independent of any satellite system, were calibrated. "Team Alpha, set up the mock quantum grid," Reynolds ordered. "Beta, I want those vintage ECM jammers operational. Charlie, get the physical targets prepped." Sergeant Miller approached, carrying what looked like a simple copper coil. "Found these in an industrial recycling center, ma'am." The corrections think they're decorative art. Reynolds grinned. "Their loss. One good electromagnetic pulse from these babies will fry their fancy neural links. How's the rest of the shopping list coming?" "Scrounge what we could from museums, recycling plants, and antique shops. Simple mirrors for blinding their optical sensors, analog radio parts, even found some old smoke grenades in a movie prop warehouse." Miller shook his head. They never thought anyone would actually use this stuff again. Above them, the ceiling trembled as a maglev train passed. Reynolds checked her mechanical chronometer. Another obsolete technology that couldn't be hacked. "Listen up," she called out. "The Corrections think they're humoring us with this demonstration. They expect us to play with our old toys and fail spectacularly. That's exactly what we want them to think." She moved to a makeshift briefing area where a physical model of the demonstration grounds had been constructed. No holograms, no quantum projections, just old-school terrain modeling that couldn't be digitally monitored. Their combat systems are built on prediction algorithms. They analyze patterns, calculate probabilities, determine optimal responses. But you know what they can't predict. She paused, meeting each soldier's eyes. Human instinct, gut feelings, the kind of crazy, irrational decisions that kept our species alive since we first picked up rocks as weapons. A younger soldier raised her hand. "But Colonel, even with all these countermeasures, their tech is still centuries ahead of ours." "Exactly. Private. Their tech is so advanced they've forgotten the basics. They don't guard against simple explosives because they're watching for antimatter bombs. They don't monitor radio waves because everyone uses quantum entanglement. They don't check for physical infiltration because their AI says it's inefficient." Reynolds pulled out a piece of chalk, another forgotten technology, and began drawing on a salvaged blackboard. "Here's how we're going to exploit every single one of those blind spots." For the next 3 hours, they drilled. Soldiers practiced disrupting energy shields with copper wire grids. Teams rehearsed using mirror arrays to confuse targeting systems. Combat engineers rigged simple mechanical traps that no eye would think to look for. "Remember," Reynolds said as they packed up for the night, "we're not just fighting for show here. Every Coraxian military observer will be watching. Every human under their protection will see this broadcast. We need to remind both sides of something important." "What's that, ma'am?" asked Chung. Reynolds picked up a simple lead pipe, testing its weight. "That humanity didn't survive ice ages, plagues, and our own nuclear mistakes by relying on predictable solutions. We survived because we're the species crazy enough to look at a problem and think, hey, what if we tried hitting it with a stick?" Laughter rippled through the tunnel, but it had an edge to it. These were the laughs of predators preparing to remind the galaxy why humans had once been feared. Above them, Coraxian sensors swept the city, their sophisticated algorithms searching for threats, completely blind to the ancient dangers stirring in the darkness below. The demonstration grounds gleamed under the morning sun, a perfect circular arena 3 kilometers in diameter. Floating cameras buzzed overhead like mechanical insects, broadcasting the event to billions across Earth and its colonies. In the VIP observation deck, Coraxian military officials lounged in their gravity chairs, their bioluminescent patterns showing amused anticipation. Reynolds stood at the head of her formation, 5,000 strong, all equipped with their primitive gear. Across the field, sleek Coraxian peacekeeping units shifted in perfect synchronization, their quantum-linked armor gleaming. "Remember," she subvocalized into her radio. Knowing modern sensors couldn't detect the ancient frequency, they're expecting a show. "Let's give them one they'll never forget." General Vithor's voice boomed across the arena. "Today we celebrate the preservation of history. Watch as these noble relics of Earth's martial past demonstrate their ancient combat forms against our modern peacekeeping forces." Reynolds caught the patronizing tone. Her grip tightened on her retrofitted rifle. "Begin on my mark," Thor announced. 3, 2, 1. The Coraxian forces moved first, their AI-driven formations flowing like liquid metal. Energy weapons charged with a high-pitched whine that their tactical computers said would intimidate the primitive humans. Instead of retreating, Reynolds's forces scattered in seemingly chaotic patterns no AI could predict because they followed no logical strategy. Before the Coraxian systems could recalculate, the humans deployed their first surprise. "Smoke protocol. Now," Reynolds barked. Hundreds of smoke grenades detonated simultaneously. The Coraxians' advanced optical sensors, calibrated for crystal-clear targeting, were suddenly blind. Their AI struggled to compensate, trying to switch to thermal imaging, just as Reynolds' troops deployed their second surprise. Mirror arrays, up. Salvaged mirrors flashed in the morning sun, creating thousands of false heat signatures. The Coraxian targeting systems crashed, overwhelmed by contradictory data. "What is this primitive trickery?" Thor demanded, his patterns flashing angry red. Reynolds didn't respond. She was too busy directing the next phase. As the Coraxians tried to regroup, human sappers had already planted their decorative copper coils. With a synchronized flip of mechanical switches, electromagnetic pulses rippled across the battlefield. Coraxian neural links went dark. Their quantum-entangled communications collapsed. Each unit, suddenly isolated, had to rely on individual programming, exactly what Reynolds had counted on. "They can't coordinate," she shouted into her radio. "Hit them with pattern echo." Her forces surged forward, using combat techniques that hadn't been seen in centuries. Soldiers rolled under energy beams, used simple rope and pulley systems to redirect force fields, and employed angles of attack that no modern AI had been programmed to expect. In the observation deck, chaos erupted. "Impossible," one Coraxian commander chittered. "Their weapons are antiques." "No," Reynolds muttered, watching her troops systematically dismantle the peacekeeping force. "They're classics." The killing blow came from the most basic of tactics, while the Coraxians focused their remaining sensors upward, expecting attacks from above. Reynolds' forces attacked from below. They'd spent the night burying simple pressure plates, technology so ancient it didn't register on modern scans. The ground beneath the Coraxian units erupted in synchronized bursts of compressed air, toppling their perfect formations. Within minutes, human soldiers had scaled the fallen peacekeepers with magnetic grapples, manually disabling their power sources with tools that predated spaceflight. In less than 15 minutes, it was over. The Strategic Reserve Force stood victorious, surrounding the disabled Coraxian units. The arena fell silent except for the whir of broadcasting drones. Reynolds looked up at the observation deck, where General Vithor sat frozen in shock. She keyed her radio one last time. "Command, this is Colonel Reynolds. The primitive humans would like to thank our advanced friends for this lovely exercise. We hope it was educational. As medics helped dazed Coraxian peacekeepers from their disabled armor, Reynolds caught glimpses of the public broadcasts. On screens across the galaxy, she saw the faces of humans watching with newfound pride, newfound hope. They'd just witnessed something profound. A reminder that humanity's strength never came from technology alone. In the end, it came from being the species that never, ever fought fair. 3 days after the demonstration, Reynolds sat in her private quarters, surrounded by ancient paper files salvaged from the Antarctic base's archives. Her victory had earned her something unexpected: access to the SRF's original mission parameters. What she found made her blood run cold. A knock at her door. "Enter," she called, recognizing Miller's distinctive pattern. 3 quick taps, 1 slow. "Ma'am, you need to see this." Miller's face was ashen as he handed her a medical tablet. "Dr. Santos finished analyzing our blood work from the revival checkups. There's something different about us." Reynolds studied the display, her military training barely keeping her hand steady. "Genetic markers." "Yes, Mom. All 5,000 of us share the same artificial genetic sequence. It's subtle, would have been impossible to spot with old tech, but it's there, woven into our DNA like a message." Reynolds picked up one of the yellowed files from her desk. "It's not a message, Sergeant. It's a signature." She handed him the document, its classification stamps faded but still legible. Pro-GCT-FIREWAL. "I don't understand," Miller said, scanning the text. His eyes widened. "Wait, is this saying what I think it's saying?" "We weren't chosen randomly," Reynolds confirmed. "We were selected because our brains are naturally resistant to certain types of influence. Specifically," she pulled up another file, "telepathic manipulation." The room seemed to grow colder as the implications sank in. Miller sank into a chair. "The corrections. They're not just our protectors, are they?" "No." Reynolds stood, pacing the room. "Look at the timing. These files show that Earth's best scientists detected something coming, subtle psychic interference affecting key decision-makers. They tried to warn people, but who'd believe in telepathy? Especially coming from the primitive humans." Reynolds nodded grimly. "So they created us. The Strategic Reserve Force. 5,000 soldiers genetically screened for natural psychic resistance, then enhanced to strengthen that trait. They put us on ice not because they thought we'd lose the war, but because they knew we'd already lost it," Miller finished. "We were Plan B insurance against mental manipulation on a global scale." Reynolds activated her old-style radio, doing a sweep for modern surveillance devices. Finding none, they never bothered checking for analog signals. She continued. "The corrections didn't win through superior technology. They won because they spent decades subtly influencing human leaders, making them more accepting of surrender, more willing to see protection as a gift rather than conquest." Miller studied the medical data again. "But why maintain the charade for centuries? Why not just wipe us out?" "Because they're farmers, not exterminators." Reynolds pulled up population statistics on her tablet. "Human population has tripled under their rule. We're thriving, breeding, expanding, all while being perfectly compliant workers and soldiers for their empire." "Like cattle," Miller spat. "Exactly. And we just showed them that some of their cattle can still bite." Reynolds ran her fingers through her hair, a habit from her pre-freeze days. "That's why they wanted us in a museum. Not to preserve history, but to contain the threat we represent." "What do we do?" Reynolds looked at the files spread across her desk. The last warning from a generation that saw the invasion coming but couldn't stop it. Then she looked at the medical data showing their unique genetic resistance. "We do what we were designed for," she said finally. "We find others like us. There have to be humans born with natural resistance. We train them, teach them to think for themselves, show them how to fight back without the corrections realizing what's happening." "A resistance," Miller asked. Using what? They control all the advanced weapons. Reynolds smiled, the same smile she'd worn before the demonstration. They control all the weapons they can detect, but we just proved that sometimes the best weapons are the ones your enemy thinks are harmless. She picked up her ancient radio. Get the word out. Training starts tonight. And Miller. Mom, tell our people. Tell them we just woke up from one war into another. And this time, we're not going back to sleep until humanity is free. The Ancient Military History and Cultural Preservation Center bustled with activity as another group of civilians filed in for their daily tour. Reynolds stood at the front of the lecture hall, dressed in her preserved combat uniform, playing her role perfectly. And this, she held up an old combat knife, is what we called a K-bar. Notice its primitive metal construction, completely unlike modern molecular edge weapons. In the audience, her trained eye picked out the one she was really teaching. The slight resistance to the Correction observer's subtle mental suggestions, the micro-expressions of genuine curiosity rather than programmed interest. 3 in this group, better than average. Now, who would like to handle some actual 21st century equipment? She asked. The selected individuals stepped forward, along with a few others for cover. As they handled the museum pieces, Reynolds's fingers brushed their wrists, checking pulses. The resistant ones had a slightly different rhythm, a telltale sign her medical team had identified. Miller, she subvocalized into her Arctic radio. 3 marks in Section 4. Tags are green, blue, and yellow shirts. Copy that, came the silent reply. Chang's team will make contact at the exit. The Correction observer, Anxfera, watched with apparent boredom. Her secondary eyes occasionally flicked to her neural monitors, checking for any suspicious patterns. But the primitive radio frequencies, the ancient hand signals, the paper notes passed between human hands, all invisible to her advanced surveillance. After the demonstration, Reynolds retreated to her office, a converted storage room filled with military memorabilia. She activated the mechanical white noise generator, another technology so old it was considered harmless. Lieutenant Chang entered, carrying a paper ledger. Today's numbers are good, Colonel. 17 new recruits identified this week. That brings us to over 300. Reynolds studied the handwritten lists. No digital records, nothing that could be hacked or scanned. How are they progressing? The natural resistance makes training easier. Once we show them how to recognize and fight the telepathic influence, it's like waking up from a dream. Chang smiled grimly. Some of them are angry. Good. Angry is useful. Reynolds stood, pacing the small room. What about the physical training? We're using the maintenance tunnels beneath the old subway systems. The Corrections think we're conducting historical reenactments. Their sensors pick up physical activity, but that's expected from a living museum. A knock at the door. Miller's pattern again. He entered quickly, his face serious. We had a close call. One of the new recruits nearly broke conditioning during a public gathering. Chang's team extracted her before she could draw attention. Reynolds frowned. We need to be more careful. One slip end. Colonel, Miller interrupted. That's not the important part. Before we got to her, she made contact with a group of off-world miners. Apparently, there are others like us out there. Whole communities of humans who've developed resistance naturally. Reynolds leaned forward. Where? The outer colonies. Places where Correction influence is weaker. They've been organizing, but quietly. They've got people inside their orbital defense networks, their communication hubs. A ready-made network, Reynolds breathed. We just need to connect the pieces. She moved to the wall map, paper of course, and began marking locations. How soon can we establish contact? Already done, Miller grinned. We used the old shipping container trick. Morse code tapped out on the hulls during transport. Completely undetectable. Reynolds felt a surge of pride. Her people had learned well. Sometimes the oldest tricks were the best ones. Keep pushing with the recruitment, she ordered. But carefully. We're building an army in plain sight, and our best weapon is that they think we're harmless relics." As if to emphasize her point, the door chime rang, the Correxian observer making her scheduled inspection. Reynolds quickly switched to her tour guide persona, ready to demonstrate more obsolete equipment. But as Vera entered, Reynolds allowed herself a small smile. Let them watch. Let them think they're studying history. They'd learn soon enough that history had a way of repeating itself, especially when humanity's freedom was on the line. The emergency alarms shattered the pre-dawn quiet of New Shanghai. Reynolds was already awake, studying intelligence reports written in physical ink, when her ancient radio crackled. "Colonel." Miller's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "You need to see the orbital feeds. Now." She rushed to the observation deck of the Cultural Center, joining a crowd of humans and Corrections staring at the sky. Through the transparent dome, she watched as streaks of purple fire tore across the stars. Correxian defense platforms being ripped apart by something her eyes couldn't quite focus on. "What am I looking at, Sergeant?" "They're calling them the Nexus Swarm." Miller handed her a pair of legacy binoculars. Organic hive mind entities. They just appeared at the edge of Correxian space 3 days ago. "They're ships." He swallowed hard. "They're alive, ma'am. They adapt to whatever hits them." Through the binoculars, Reynolds finally saw them. Massive, crystalline structures that seemed to pulse and shift, absorbing energy weapons and redistributing the force through their living hull. "The Correxian defense grid is failing," Chime reported, joining them. "Their AI can't predict the swarm's movements. Every algorithm they try gets countered within minutes. It's like the damn things are evolving in real time." Reynolds watched as another defense platform exploded. Casualties. 3 colony worlds already gone. The Correxians. Chang lowered his voice. "They're losing. Badly. Their entire military doctrine is based on predictive AI. But you can't predict something that changes its own nature every time you engage it." The observation deck doors hissed open. General Cathor strode in, his normally immaculate uniform showing signs of hasty dressing. His bioluminescent patterns were flashing emergency signals. "Colonel Reynolds," his translator couldn't quite hide the desperation in his voice. "A word, please." She followed him to a private chamber, noting how his secondary eyes kept darting to the tactical displays showing more defense platforms falling. "Your demonstration last month," he said without preamble. "Your forces showed an ability to adapt, to think in patterns our systems couldn't predict. That's one way of putting it. We need that ability now." His patterns shifted to deep blue, a signal of extreme stress. "The swarm, they fight like you do. Irrationally. Instinctively. Our weapons are useless because our targeting systems can't establish valid solution paths." Reynolds kept her face neutral, even as her mind raced with possibilities. "What exactly are you asking, General? Help us." The words seemed to physically pain him. "Your strategic reserve force. Your primitive methods. They might be our only chance against an enemy that evolves faster than our AI can adapt. And in return, name your price." Reynolds smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Independence, complete and total freedom for humanity. No more protection, no more subtle control. You know," his patterns flashed with surprise, "we've always known. It's why we were created." She stepped closer. "Those are our terms. Freedom for our help." A massive explosion lit up the sky. Another defense platform dying. Victor's patterns rippled with conflicting emotions. The High Command will never agree. They'd rather die than admit humans are their equals. "Then they'll die," Reynolds said flatly. "The swarm is coming, General. You can face them with us as allies, or you can face them alone. But understand this, we won't fight for our own chains." The general was silent for a long moment, watching through the window as chaos spread across the stars. Finally, his pattern settled into a resolute purple. "I'll need to contact the High Command. But first," he turned to her, Tell me how you would fight these creatures." Reynolds lifted her ancient radio. "Miller, Chung, get in here and bring the old tactical manuals. All of them." As her officers rushed in with paper maps and hand-drawn battle plans, Reynolds felt a fierce pride. The Corrections had spent centuries making humanity forget how to fight dirty, how to think outside their perfect predictive models. But they'd forgotten something crucial. Humans had spent millennia fighting monsters before they ever reached the stars. It was time to remember how. The bridge of the Correction flagship Eternal Algorithm had been transformed. Where sleek quantum displays once dominated, paper maps now covered the walls. Where AI processors once hummed, human soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with purple-skinned aliens, plotting battle plans with pencils and protractors. Reynolds traced a line across the star chart, her finger following the swarm's predicted path. "They're not random," she explained to the assembled commanders. "They're using chaos as a weapon, making us think they're unpredictable to hide the patterns within patterns." "Like your demonstration," Thor mused. "The apparent disorder concealing precise coordination." "Exactly." Reynolds turned to the tactical display, where real-time footage showed the latest swarm assault. They're fighting like ancient Earth hive insects. Termites. Ants. Individual units sacrificing themselves to test defenses, then adapting their entire species based on the results. A massive crystalline ship appeared on the main screen, its living hull pulsing with alien energy. As they watched, it absorbed a direct hit from a Correction quantum cannon, its structure realigning to channel the energy through itself. "Now," Reynolds barked into her radio. Hidden among the debris of destroyed defense platforms, human-piloted ships launched their attack. Not with energy weapons or antimatter torpedoes, but with clouds of simple metal particles, chaff, an electronic warfare technique so old it had been forgotten by modern combat systems. The chaff clouds surrounded the crystal ship, its countless surfaces refracting and reflecting energy in countless directions. The living hull, trying to adapt to thousands of minimal threats simultaneously, began to fragment under the strain. "Phase 2, Reynolds ordered. Correction ships, now stripped of their AI targeting systems and piloted manually, opened fire with modified weapons designed by human engineers. The crystalline vessel, its adaptive capabilities overwhelmed by information overload, couldn't compensate fast enough. It shattered, its pieces dying like broken glass in space. "One down," Miller reported from his station. "But the swarm's already learning. They're changing formation." "Good," Reynolds smiled, "because we're about to change everything." She nodded to Chung, who activated their final surprise. Across the battlefield, thousands of tiny pods, designed by human engineers and built in secret during their museum demonstrations, activated simultaneously. Each released a unique frequency of electromagnetic noise, creating a cacophony of conflicting signals. The swarm ships, which had evolved to process and adapt to clear patterns, found themselves drowning in an ocean of random data. Their organic hulls writhed, trying to adapt to everything at once and succeeding at nothing. "All units," Reynolds broadcast on all frequencies, "execute Protocol Chaos." The combined human Correction fleet attacked, each ship following its own unpredictable pattern, each weapon modified to produce slightly different effects. No two attacks were identical. No pattern could be learned and countered. The swarm, for the first time, began to retreat. Hours later, as damage reports flowed in and victory celebrations began, Reynolds stood in the flagship's observation deck with General Thor. "The High Command has approved the Independence Treaty," he said quietly. "It will be announced tomorrow. Humanity has earned its freedom." Reynolds watched the stars, thinking of all the centuries her people had spent frozen, waiting for this moment. "Freedom isn't given, General. It's remembered. I understand that now." His patterns shifted to a color she'd never seen before. "Respect. We thought we were uplifting you, protecting you from your own primitive nature. But that nature," he gestured to the battlefield, where the remaining swarm ships were in full retreat. It was your greatest strength all along. Humanity's gift isn't technology or prediction or perfect order, Reynolds agreed. It's our chaos. Our ability to look at an impossible problem and try something stupid that just might work. The general's translator made a sound that might have been laughter. Will you teach us? Not just to fight, but to think like you do. Reynolds thought of her soldiers, still teaching historical combat techniques that had just saved a civilization. She thought of all the humans who'd maintained their resistance through centuries of subtle control. She thought of the future, not as protected subjects, but as equals among the stars. Yes, she said finally. We'll teach you. After all, she smiled. That's what museums are for. Indy.